I am so happy about this. You guys, you have no idea. So Courtney Jones out of Arizona. I've gotten to know her very well in the last few months. Very quiet, very humble. She's just there. I got to tell you what, she is. I'm going to use the word, I'm going to swear a little bit here. She is badass. She really is. She has been investing for 30 years. Yeah, I mean, let's everybody give her a round of applause because you guys just wait. She is fantastic. But so she's been through it, right? She's won some, she's lost some, she's owned her own brokerage. She had 25 people working for her at one time. She's done flips, 500. She's been there, done it. She was buying 6, 7, 8, a month. I mean, she was doing the real thing, full guts to like more of the unicorn. So she's been there, she's done it. The best part about her is she has a very incredible gift to teach. And not only that, but to speak very, very simply. She never makes you wrong. I mean, you can come to her with some crazy old questions and say, I got this, I don't know what happened. She's like, oh, you just need to do this, this, and this. So she's absolutely fantastic. So listen to her. She is a wealth of knowledge. It's about creative financing. And today it's really important, especially us. Some of us don't have a W-2. We're entrepreneurs. We're living the dream. And what happens is, it's kind of hard to lend to us because, at the end we need to have 0, 0, 0, right? So it's like, oh man. But while you're out there wholesaling and you're finding deals, you're talking to people, be creative. Let's think outside the box. So I don't want to talk anymore because she's fantastic. But anyway, welcome, Courtney Jones. There we go. Give her a round of applause, everybody.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I want to meet that person. She sounds amazing.
She is.
Okay, so first of all, I have to share my new phone cover.
There it
is a hummingbird because, as Rochelle said, I really do love my hummingbirds. In fact, I'll get distracted every now and then when we're talking because I have 2 feeders right outside my window here. And I'll be like, oh, so if you see me do that, it's just because my little babies are there. So I'm going to share my screen real quick so I can show you our presentation. I won't be able to talk to you a little bit about owner financing today. And as everybody said, it'll be 30 years that I've been doing creative financing in November. So 30 years in November. And there's only been a couple times when I bought a house through traditional means with normal bank financing. And usually those are my own homes. Almost all of the 600, 800, I don't know, I never kept track, plus transactions I've done through creative financing. So as Deborah said early on, it's really a tool in your toolbox, but for some people and for myself, it's really the only tool I've ever known. And we're gonna talk about some of the different ways that it's done. But, I got started in this business with like virtually nothing. And I was young, I was 19. And so I think that this is a really good, viable option. The tools I'm going to teach you tonight for anyone who maybe has damaged credit or no credit or just is really low on cash. So it's a way to be able to completely do this business. And like I said, I have done hundreds, if not 1,000 or more transactions. And I don't think I've ever used bank financing on an investment property. I mean, I could be wrong because I'm getting older and I forget stuff. So there might've been 1 or 2, but I don't think there has been. So there's definitely a lot here that can completely just change your business if what you've been doing is just traditional type investment deals. So hopefully you have a pen and paper handy. And as Deborah said, this is a 5-module program. I'm going to go through the overview today to give you some basic understanding of what the different owner and seller financing terms mean and how a basic functioning of the transactions works. And then in the other modules, we'll break down each of them and get into them in more detail. So I'd like to start just by giving you a disclaimer that I am not an attorney and I'm not available to give legal advice, nor is any of the advice that I'm giving you legal advice. You are encouraged to seek your own counsel and to do your own diligence and to seek professional help. I'm also not an attorney or a CPA. So people love to ask me about the tax stuff. If there is anything I know zero about, it is tax stuff. If you want to see my eyes glaze over, send me a spreadsheet any day. I do not understand it, and I don't want to understand it, and I have no desire to understand it. So I am not in any way, shape, or form giving tax advice or legal advice tonight. So what we are going to do is I'm going to tell you about some of the transactions that I've done over the years and how we have formatted them so that you can find out how you can buy property using little to no money of your own and using seller financing as one of the options. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is owner financing. Okay, so people hear about this term all the time, but what does that mean? I'm going to go through the basics of what you need to know. And then I'm going to cover the various forms of owner financing. There's a lot of terms that get thrown around. A lot of them are similar. A lot of them just have tiny little tweaks that make them a little bit different. Some of them are not so different than the next and all that. So we're going to cover all that so that you have a good, clear understanding of what those are. Why would you want to use owner financing? We'll talk about that. I covered a little bit of that already. And then deeper dive into each of the tools. And then we'll talk about how you can learn more and dig into it a little bit more. So let me get you here. I'm going to move this out of the way. Sorry. So we're going to start with what is owner financing or seller financing. It's the same thing. So those two terms are used interchangeably, owner financing or seller financing. In a seller financing transaction, the thing that you have to know is that basically the seller is taking on the role of the traditional lender, okay? So instead of a buyer giving cash to the seller is extending enough credit to the buyer to purchase the property minus any down payment. So basically the seller's becoming the new Wells Fargo or Bank of America or whoever traditional lender is that you use, okay? So instead of going to a bank to get a loan, you're working with the seller or the owner of the property. Now, depending on how much they owe on the property will depend on the options that you have available to you, which is kind of what we're going to look at in detail tonight. So what kind of options are available to you? So here's some of the various forms of seller financing and terms that you'll hear people refer to. So a favorite of mine, and one that I've done hundreds of transactions with, is buying subject to. So I'm going to talk about that tonight and some of the pros of that and what that looks like. Lease options. Another very good one. Owner carryback, full owner finance. So people don't usually call it full owner finance, but they'll just say owner finance. But the way I'm going to describe it tonight is as a full owner finance, and you'll see why when I get there. And a wraparound mortgage, an all-inclusive trust deed, a land contract, and then assumable loans, okay? And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about cross-collateralizing, and I don't know why I don't have that bullet on there, sorry. So some of the basics that you need to know. So I'm just going to assume that everybody on the call has a little bit of this knowledge, but for that one person who has no idea and is brand new, I want to cover this because otherwise the rest will be extremely confusing, and I don't want that. So just super basic stuff, and for those that do know, I apologize, but there's two basic things that you need to do any kind of financing transaction when it comes to real estate, and that's a promissory note and a mortgage or deed of trust, okay? So two separate things, a promissory note and a mortgage or deed of trust. Depending on your state, it would either be a mortgage or a deed of trust. A promissory note is basically a document that spells out the who, what, where, when, why, and how, okay? So it's, I agree to give you a loan for X amount of dollars, and you're going to pay me back in X amount of time, X amount per month, with such and such % interest, and so forth, okay? The difference between a promissory note in real estate is that it is also going to identify, if it's written properly, the collateral that is being used for that promissory note. So like I could go and buy a really cool hummingbird feeder and give them a promissory note to pay for it, and it may not be secured to anything. But when you're buying a house that's several $100,000s or more, depending on where you live, obviously you want to secure that to something as collateral, okay? And that's where the mortgage or deed of trust comes in. So depending on where you live. So the mortgage or deed of trust is basically a legal agreement by which a bank or other creditor lends money at interest in exchange for taking title of the debtor's property, with the condition that the conveyance of the title becomes void upon the payment of the debt. So in other words, it basically says, I owe you money, and I'm pledging this house as my collateral. And so you, whoever you are that's loaning me money, Wells Fargo as an example, has a lien on my property until I pay this note off in full. Okay, so that's why when you go to finance regular real estate, you can't go sell it without having to pay off the first loan, okay, because that's secured to that promissory note, and that deed takes care of that. Okay, that makes sense? Give me some nods up. All right, good. So a typical transaction works like this. A buyer finds a home that they like. The buyer makes an offer on the home. An offer gets accepted by the seller. The buyer goes to the bank or mortgage company and applies for the loan. The loan gets approved. At the closing, the buyer signs documents, including a promissory note and deed of trust or mortgage. Buyer gets to live in the property. The bank or mortgage company holds the security by the lien, the property, and the property cannot be sold until it is paid off. Okay, so that's like typical. Okay, in an owner finance transaction, the seller takes the place of the bank or mortgage company. Okay, so the seller is now in place of Wells Fargo or Citibank or whoever you happen to be getting your traditional loans from. Okay, and in order to do that, they're going to want the same type of documentation. You're still going to create things like a promissory note and a deed of trust. Now, in that typical transaction I just gave you, obviously there's a lot of things that were skipped. There's a lot of due diligence that goes involved and home inspections and all that. I realize all that, but for sake of trying to get to the financing aspect, I abbreviated that. Okay, so the owner financing transaction, the seller is taking the place of the mortgage company. Now, why would an investor do this? Let me see if I can move this little guy here. There we go. Yay. Okay. So why would an investor use this? Well, I mentioned early on at the beginning, when I started, I didn't have any money really. So that was why I used it. I didn't have any money and I didn't really have any credit. So that's a particularly good way and reason to use it. There's also less costs and money out of pocket. You know, most people would be extremely limited to the number of transactions they could do if they had to put 30% down on every single transaction. You know, the idea of retiring wealthy with a lot of buy and hold properties, if you're putting 30% down, is going to take you a long time in order to do that. For most people, saving a 30% down payment and then buying one property and then waiting to save another 30% down payment and buying another property isn't exactly going to give you a tremendous wealth, you know. So having less costs and money out of pocket is huge. Of course, with less costs and money out of pocket comes a higher ROI. So if I have less money in the deal and I'm making $300 a month in cash flow, or I'm flipping a property and I'm making $30,000 and I have zero money in the deal, then I certainly have a higher return on my investment. In fact, it's infinite because I had no money in the deal. So that's another huge reason to do it. No bank qualifying. You can move more quickly. You know, if I have to wait for a bank on every single transaction, that takes a long time. And like right now, banks are super bogged down with refinances, and so they're moving super slow on just about everything. So if you're buying something that requires moving quickly, like a foreclosure or something along those lines, or you've got a screaming hot deal and somebody's like, hey, you can have this screaming hot deal, but I need an answer in 48 hours, you can't wait for 6 weeks for a bank to make a decision. There's no bank limit on the number of houses that you can buy. So when you're doing owner financing type transactions, when you're buying owner financing, not selling, just by the way, but when you're buying using owner financing transactions, there's no limit to the number that you can do. So you can continue to build your wealth and grow property. So if you want to have a arsenal of real estate properties that you buy and hold, and you want them to generate cash flow for you, you could be in a wealth type situation in a very short period of time, a year or two, easily, just by buying as many houses as you can get your hands on, by knowing the tools that we're going to talk about tonight. You're not subject to lending changes. Now, this is huge. We're going through a lot of that right now. Lenders are changing their qualifications and what they'll do for you by the hour almost right now. This is not the first time, and certainly in my investing career, it's happened. When I first got into the investing was when the savings loan crash was happening. So I'm kind of used to these types of things. They happen every 10 or so years, and you're at the mercy of the lenders and when they decide they want to change things. So you don't have that when you're doing owner financing type situations. You just have to be able to be credible and build trust and likability with people, and be able to present it in a way that makes sense for the seller. And two of my favorite ways are actually really seller motivated. So there's definite tax advantages, even though I'm not a tax person, to seller and ways that you can make the offer more attractive to them. And then you also, the last one is basically that you can continue to provide income to a seller. So if you have someone that is like say an absentee landlord right now, and they're earning money, but they're sick of this property and they want to get rid of it. Really what they want to get rid of is not the property, but they want to get rid of the headaches that go along with that property. So they want to get rid of the tenants and the toilets and all the things that go along with that, you know? And so a lot of times this is where this comes in really handy, is to be able to say to them, hey, how much are you earning on this property now? Well, let's say they're earning $150 a month, which is kind of common in cash flow. Well, if I can send you $700 a month, but you didn't have the headaches or anything like that, and I took care of everything, would that be more appealing to you? Well, you've just like quadrupled their money or more and taken away all of the headaches. So presented in the right way with trust behind that presentation, you can definitely offer that as a favorable option for them. So those are some of the reasons why an investor would use creative financing type things. Now, why would a seller accept this? And actually, thanks to my husband, we have this slide because I completely didn't put it in there. And when I was going through my presentation, he's like, well, the number one question you get asked is, why would a seller do this? So I added this in, thanks to him. So it's true. You know, a lot of times sellers don't know that this is an option. So it's just simply presenting them with this. A lot of sellers have never heard of such a thing, or if they have heard of it, it's very elusive in that they don't know what that means. They think that you can only do seller financing if you have money, you know, and that's not true. The equity in their house can be enough. So some of the reasons that a seller will do these deals is that they can get a higher price for their home. Okay, whenever there's favorable financing, people will pay more for a house. Okay, including investors. Often on occasions, I will give a seller a full price offer on their house for the right type of financing that goes along with it. If I can get 0 or 1% financing on the house, will I pay you full price for it? Absolutely, because almost all of the money that I'm paying you every single month is going to buy down the principal. And I'm going to come out better in the long run. They can sell more quickly. So if they want to sell more quickly, depending on the type of market that you're in, that can be a huge reason for sellers to do this. If they need to sell ASAP and you're the only person they're talking to, which happens a lot. I know it's hard to believe when, you know, most of us are in competitive markets, but there are still a lot of deals that I get in front of where I'm the only person they're talking to. And so when they need to sell because they're in a situation, the only thing I'm offering them is an owner financing type solution, then they don't know any better and they're in a situation where they need to do something quickly. So that's a definite reason why they take it. Tax advantages to the seller, especially if it's not their primary residence. If they don't live in the house and they haven't lived in it for 2 of the last 5 years and they sell it and they get all cash for it, they're going to have some serious tax repercussions on that. But if they do it in some sort of an installment sale where they're only getting monthly payments, then the tax consequences aren't as heavy for them all at one time. So that's a huge reason. To continue receiving monthly income, in other words, like the landlord type situation that I mentioned. And then if they're over leveraged or they have little to no equity, then oftentimes they don't have a choice but to accept seller financing as an option. And then if they can't sell through traditional means, meaning like the house has too much work, or, you know, we had one time it was 2 properties deeded on 1 lot. So obviously not an easy sell unless, you know, there's not a lot of buyers out there looking for 2 houses at once. So there's different reasons why they might have some difficulty selling through traditional means, and this might be a good option for them. The thing to remember with owner financing type situations is that there is no right or wrong way to structure a deal. Everybody always, like Rochelle was saying, like, I'll be helping somebody with a deal and they'll be like, well, here's how I did it. Is that right? What's right is what works for you and what works for the seller. So that's the one thing to remember. There is just really no right or wrong way to do this. Now, you can do the paperwork incorrectly or things, you know, you could not do title search and make some mistakes and things like that. But as far as structuring owner finance deals, there's really just no right or wrong way to do it. It's a matter of listening to the sellers and finding out what their needs are and how you can fulfill those needs, and then making them an offer that works for them and meets their needs, but also works for you. So the one thing I like to say all the time, a key phrase I like to say to people is, you know, what the house can afford to do is XYZ. You know, so I don't put it on, hey, this is all I can do, or this, you know, anything that they have to do or whatever. It's, this is what the house can afford, okay? Because if a house can only generate $1,500 a month in rent, for instance, I can't pay them $1,800 a month, you know, and then I'll just use that phrasing to say, you know, this house really can only afford a $1,500 a month payment. So it's all 100% negotiable, and it's based on what works for each party, okay? So how's that tracking with everybody so far? Everybody give me a thumbs up and let me know that you are hearing me okay and all is going well.
Hey, Courtney, we have a quick question. Can we break in for a quick question? This is actually from Renata. Some sellers are very hesitant and they think it is a lot of risks for them. What are the best ways to encourage them to do a seller financing?
Well, I like to wrestle them to the ground and pin them down.
Courtney, you're not supposed to tell them that. I love it.
Okay, we can't do that anymore, I guess, because of COVID. So, so it's all about how you, okay, so first of all, if an attorney gets involved with the seller, you almost 100% of the time, the attorney will advise them not to. And that's perfectly fine. You know, people get really nervous, investors get really nervous when attorneys get involved because they're like, they're going to kill the deal. Well, they're not really trying to kill the deal. Their fiduciary responsibility is to protect their client. And is there more risk with the client financing the deal to us than us just paying them cash and the client walking away? Of course there is, you know. So it would be whatever a bad thing, it would be a bad thing for them to not advise their client to not do that deal. Does that make sense? Did I say that weird, like, but anyway, you know, yeah. So, I mean, they have to do that because it's their job to protect them. But what I like to do is to just, obviously, first and foremost, I'm always about building rapport with my seller. Once a seller likes you and trusts you, and there's a lot of things that you have to do in a presentation to make that happen. It is not a 20-minute presentation and then asking for a seller finance situation. That is not at all how I handle things. You have to build trust. It takes time, and you have to build rapport with people. There's a lot of things that I do in my presentations that build that rapport, that show credibility. I have tons and tons of testimonials of people who I've done these deals with who will say, you know, my attorney is one of the first references on my presentation kit that I give to people, and it tells them right out front, like, you know, how many deals she's done for me, how many transactions she's closed. You know, she's my first thumbs up of seal of approval. So there's a lot of little things that go along in it, but yeah, I mean, sure, in general, sellers have oftentimes never heard of it, or if they have, they're concerned about their risks. So what you have to do is point out how you're going to mitigate those risks for them. And when you do that to the level that makes them feel comfortable, then they will move forward with the transaction. If they still feel uncomfortable, then you haven't done your job fully and enough. Okay?
Educating them, sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so we have one other quick question, I think, Courtney, I think this one is kind of quick. Do you hire an attorney and title company?
Well, yes. I mean, I have an attorney who is in my title company, but I don't hire one for every transaction anymore. Now I know how to do them, so I just do them myself, but she does close them all for me.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to start with lease options. This one's probably the easiest one, and probably the, I would say, intro for a lot of people into owner financing type situations. I have done a couple of these over the years, but once I learned subject to, I never went back to lease options, and I'll show you that when we get to it. But a lease option is basically, I have their AKA, also known as a lease with an option to purchase or rent to own. Okay, those are all basically the same terms that are used for terminology that is used for the same type of a transaction. Okay, now the key thing to remember is that what I'm talking about right now in lease options is, remember that I'm the investor and I'm buying the property on a lease option. Okay, so there's some things that are different than if I were selling it to a tenant buyer who I'm lease optioning it to, okay? So right now we're just talking about how to buy property using creative financing, not selling it. So in a lease option, a property owner, the seller, and a tenant, myself, like as an investor, agree that at the end of the specified rental period for this property, that I have the option, okay? The option means that I have the right, but not the obligation to purchase the property at a predetermined price. So I might meet with you, Mr. Seller, today, and we might agree that I'm going to purchase this property for $300,000 in 2 years, okay? I have the right to do that when we sign this paperwork together, but I do not have the obligation to do that, okay? And that's why a lot of people like lease options, is because there's not a lot of obligation on the part of the buyer investor. In this case, obviously, you would want the rights to sublease to someone else. Otherwise, there's no point. It's not an investment property. And you do need it to be able to cash flow, okay? So if I'm going to be if I'm going to be agreeing with the seller that I'm going to purchase the property at $300,000, for instance, in a few years, I also want to make sure that those monthly payments are something that the house can afford to still generate cash flow. So if I say to the seller, I'll give you $1,500 a month, then I need to know that I can rent it for $1,700 or $1,800 or whatever, okay? So that's a little bit about lease options and how they work. Now, here's an example of how this would look. So the house might be worth, say, $300,000. I would have an option contract to purchase from the seller at $300,000, let's say by March 31st, 2023, okay? And I'm going to pay them monthly rent of $1,600, okay? So that's kind of my agreement with the seller. And then what I would do is I would turn around and sell it on a lease option to a tenant buyer for $350,000, okay? I would say go to 3/31/22, so maybe a year earlier, so that I have time to make some adjustments, okay? And I'm going to rent it for $2,000, so I've got a $400 spread there between what I'm paying the seller and what I'm collecting. And then I would charge them an option consideration of $5,000 for that right. Now, tenant buyers, people who get into lease option contracts, are typically used to paying an option consideration for the right. So they're locking in a price today of $350, and in order to be able to lock in that price, again, they have the right, not the obligation. They pay an option consideration of $5,000. Now, that option consideration is non-refundable. Okay, so that comes to me. So that's money that goes straight into my pocket, that $5,000, and then I'm making $400 a month spread on that. Okay, the house is still in the seller's name, and I just have a contract agreement with the seller for the lease option. Make sense? Okay, all right. Now, that's a little bit about how lease options work. So typically with a lease option, you'll have two.
Courtney, one quick question about lease option. Does the monthly payment over the property cover the property taxes and insurance?
It depends on what you negotiate, but typically yes. So it's going to be like rent. So typically think of a lease option contract like a rental contract. Basically, people consider that they're renting the property. I have seen some lease option contracts set up where you're paying those separately, but that's certainly, remember the key rule at the beginning, it's totally negotiable. But usually lease options are treated more like rental contracts with just an option to purchase. Okay?
Perfect. Thank you. Yep, thanks.
Okay, so now a full owner finance, and a couple things are going to sprout off of this, if you will. So a full owner finance is typically used on a completely free and clear owned home. Okay, so as of July 2019, 37% of houses are owned without a mortgage.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah,
like
that's
people
crazy.
think that is like so astounding, but yeah, I mean, that's basically 4 out of 10 houses are all owned without a mortgage. So this particular option allows for the most flexibility. And if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. You have a clean slate. There's no mortgage on it, so you can really do anything you want. You can do a full 30-year amortization, or you can do any variation of that. You can include a balloon payment, but it doesn't have to. Okay, you can include a down payment, but it doesn't have to. You can do whatever interest rate you want. For a long time, we were doing 0% interest rates on owner finance deals. You know, I think you've probably heard this, car salesman will talk about how people are really just interested in whatever the monthly payment is. They don't really think about how much the actual car costs. They just care about, can they afford it every month? And oftentimes with owner finance deals, that's sort of what they're thinking about. The sellers are thinking about, what am I going to be getting per month? And we've done many transactions where we've paid 0% interest to the seller. It's just that we presented in a way where, oh, your house is worth $250,000. Well, certainly we can give you the full $250,000. How about if we give that to you in monthly payments of $800 a month and then we figure out what the term is at 0%. And they never ask, oh, well, what interest are you going to pay me? So if they don't ask, I don't offer. Now, a couple years into doing that, we found out there is actually an IRS required minimum. Remember that tax thing I told you about? So there is an actual IRS required minimum called the applicable federal rate that you do have to use, which right now is like 1.7%. So it's still pretty low, but you are supposed to use that. So just be aware of that now. Consider yourself known. So this is totally just a clean slate. Like the seller owns this house free and clear. You can do whatever you want to with this, okay? Remember, what's going to happen is the seller is going to be creating a promissory note and a mortgage or deed of trust, depending on your state, to secure that property. So whether you give them a large chunk of money as a down payment or no money, or how much you give them per month and for what term, if they want it to last forever, or, we've had them where the person has said, look, I'm 75 years old, but I want this to be my kids, or one of them was a grandchild. I want this to be her money one day. We were like, well, okay, she's 16, when do you want her to have this? And we took this person to the attorney and had the whole thing drawn up, where we did the whole thing. They did a will and everything. So this all went into a trust, and they knew that the granddaughter was going to be getting all of that money when they passed along. So it's as creative as you want to get with it, and you can come up with the numbers exactly that work for you and what you can make work for the house. Okay, so here's an example. Seller owns the home worth $250,000 free and clear. Okay, they don't need the money because they're moving in with family. This often happens with elderly. Okay, and you know that you can rent the property for $1,700 a month. We get a lot of free and clear deals that we look for non-owner occupied ones. So these are people who've owned the property and have typically rented it out. So they're used to getting a monthly income from the property. But they're used to having the headaches that go along with those properties. So we're going to be able to offer them typically way more than what they would get cash flow wise if they owned the home and were dealing with all the headaches. So I might say something like, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, I can absolutely pay you full price on the house. How about if I send you $900 on the first of each month until the house is paid in full? Essentially, they're becoming the bank and collecting the money now instead of having to pay it like they did for 30 years before. So in this case here, that was the 1.75% interest that was calculated on a 30-year amortized loan with no down payment. So I'm not offering a down payment right up front, and I'm not talking to them about interest. I'm just talking to them about that $900 payment. So if they were renting it and they were used to getting $700, $750, something along those lines, then I can say, hey, how about if I send you $900 on the first of every month, type of thing. And we're going to draw that up, and they're going to have a promissory note, and then they're going to hold the mortgage on that property. So I can't sell that property without them getting their full payment, and I can't transfer it or do anything without them getting everything that they're owed. So they're completely protected.
That's
Any
great.
questions on that?
Yeah, quick question on this one. It says, this is from Angie Hunt. I would assume a percentage of those paid homes are owned by seniors. Are there special steps that you take to ensure that there is never a problem with lack of understanding or predatory concerns?
Well, I explain everything really well. I ask repeatedly if they understand. We have a CYA document that we use, and then we close it at a title company, which is their responsibility to explain it as well. So, and then if I ever am in question, like if I ever felt like someone didn't understand or maybe didn't have their full capacity about them, I would certainly bring in someone. Like, do you have a child who helps you make decisions? And usually it's an adult child that helps you make decisions that you would like to have me explain this to, and that kind of thing, to just make sure. I actually encourage that too, because if they're going to go back and explain it to the kids, then oftentimes things get messed up in the translation. And so if somebody has an adult child that's going to help them make the decision, it's better for you to present it and the details than for them to do that. So when we get into that discussion, I'll ask them, you know, those questions to just make sure. But if you're ever in doubt, you know, make sure someone else is in the room and that you're explaining it in a way that everybody is on the same page, that you're getting good checks, you know, are you tracking with me kind of thing. You know, you can tell if people are understanding or not. And if you're ever in question, just don't do it. Or,
Yeah.
you know, make sure an attorney explains it at the closing.
Perfect. Thanks, Courtney.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the next one is buying subject to the existing financing. And this is one of my favorites, and it's often, people don't know this one a lot. This is a really great way to buy properties, and I've bought, most of our buy and holds have been purchased through this method. So it's usually done when there's little to no equity for the seller, okay? Usually, not always. It's often used in pre-foreclosure type situations. Okay, so little to no equity, pre-foreclosure. And what happens in a subject to transaction is that I, as the investor, am taking over the existing loan that the seller has. So you as a seller go to the bank and you get a mortgage on your property, and then you need to sell because you're going through foreclosure and you can't make your payments anymore. Okay, well, you already have a loan in your name and you're in a desperate situation. If you don't want your credit to be completely ruined, then the way that I will present it to you is that, would it help you if I took over the payments and started making these payments for you and got this debt out of your mind? And then that gives them a lot of relief, okay? The existing loan stays in the name of the seller. The property is deeded to me, the investor, without any bank qualifying or bank notification, okay? And I get all the tax benefits going forward. Now, what I choose to do with this house is totally up to me. Okay, I can turn around and sell it right out. I can fix it up and rent it out. I can fix it up and sell it. I could sell it exactly as it is. I mean, it's my house. So the house gets deeded to me. So they sign a warranty deed over to me. So the house is mine now, but the existing loan stays in place. Now, the question is always, well, how do you do that without qualifying? So every loan has a clause in it called a due on sale clause. Well, not every loan. Most loans have a clause in them called the due on sale clause. And the due on sale clause, if you pull out your own mortgage and read this, says if this property changes hands or if the deed changes names, we may call the loan due. It doesn't say they will. It doesn't say it's forbidden. It doesn't say it's illegal. In fact, if you look on a HUD statement, on the right-hand side, I think it's line 503, it's right in the HUD statement. It is a normal transaction. In fact, in commercial, subject to financing is very, very, very common. But in residential, for some reason, people think it's like really weird. But it's very common, and it's printed right on the HUD. So the investor continues to get the tax benefits. The only thing the seller gets is relief. Okay, so the seller uses this in a situation where they have little to no equity, or they're in a desperate situation like going through a foreclosure or something along those lines. Okay, so I'll show you a sample of that. So let's say, for instance, a seller purchased a $300,000 home via an FHA loan. Okay, so FHA loan, 3% down, and they did it a year ago. So they haven't had much time to build much equity, right? And they haven't paid down much of the debt yet because it's only been a year, okay? So the approximate balance of the loan at that point would be about $295,000. So I did consult an amortization schedule for these numbers, but I also rounded. So if you're like the detail-oriented engineer type and you're checking my math, it'll be rounded, okay? So the seller gets a job transfer and has to report within 3 weeks. This is actually a real type case that just happened not too long ago. And they have 3 weeks to get to this new job or they lose it. So the house needs paint and carpet, about $10,000. And once you pay real estate commissions, that'd be about $18,000. So the home is worth $315,000 today. And if you take into consideration the fact that they'd have to do the paint, carpet, and pay real estate commissions, the seller would have to come to closing with $8,000 to sell their home. Okay, so not really a viable option for a lot of sellers, especially if they're reporting to a new job in 3 weeks and they have to find a new place to live. Okay, coming to closing with $8,000 to sell their home is not a viable option for a lot of people. Now, we have had people pay us to buy their home, but That's neither here nor there. So in this case here, what I would do is buy the house subject to the existing financing. In other words, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I'm happy to help you, and we can help you get moved in no time. The 3 weeks will be plenty of time for us to take care of this. So I'm going to be contractually responsible for the remaining mortgage balance of approximately $295,000, which is roughly $1,400 a month. I'm getting a house worth $315,000. So essentially I'm getting $20,000 worth of equity, but you know that that first $20,000 or so is not really real equity if you have to go sell the house right now, okay? Because you have to do these other things. I have to put in the new carpet and paint. And then what I would do with it, for me, is I would sell it on a lease option for approximately $339,000 with a 2-year option. So in that 2-year time frame, the balance would be paid down a little bit. So the balance would be about $290,000. I would require a $15,000 down payment for the option consideration. Okay, $5,000 of that goes in my pocket. $10,000 goes to the carpet and paint. I'd be collecting $1,700 a month rent. And remember, my mortgage payment is approximately $1,400. So I'd be getting $300 a month in cash flow, plus about $15,000 up front. Really just $5,000 of that goes in my pocket because I did have to do the carpet and paint. And then in 2 years, when those people are ready to purchase the house, then I'd be getting an additional $39,000. So it really gives you cash now, cash up front, and cash later, which is really what I like. Cash flow, cash now, and cash later, okay? That's why I love those transactions. Any questions on that one?
No, this is fantastic. We love what we got, all the information that you're giving us, but we're running out of time, Courtney.
Okay, I'll speed it up a little.
Okay, so how much do we have? What do we got? How much do we have left? What's we got?
We are 5 minutes over, but we're doing good.
All right. Okay, so an owner carryback is basically an owner agrees to carry the note for some portion of the loan in lieu of down payment, new financing, gap funding, or anything like that. Okay, so again, just a typical type of owner financing. Another word that is used to describe it is owner carryback. So an owner carryback is going to come into play when, for instance, the house might be worth $500, but there's an existing mortgage of $300. And let's say as an investor, I only want to pay $400 for it. Okay, so in this case, I could, if I went traditional means, I'd have to go get financing for $400,000. Or if I got them to accept the $400,000, I could take over the first mortgage subject to, and then the seller could do a carryback or a note or mortgage for the second mortgage of $100,000. Okay, so it's created exactly the same way. They're just carrying back. So remember, as an investor, my goal is to always put in as very little, if any, money into a deal as possible. And this is just another way that allows me to do that. Okay, so legal title is held by me, the investor. And in this case, what would happen is I'd be making a first mortgage payment to the mortgage company, and then I'd be making a second payment to the seller. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so that's an owner carryback. So the owner is just taking a big chunk of their equity in a note and getting monthly payments for that. A wraparound mortgage or all-inclusive trust deed is very similar. Okay, the seller extends to the buyer a junior mortgage that wraps around the existing loan. So in the same case as what we just talked about, let's say the house is worth $500,000. They have an existing $300,000. I offer $400,000. Instead of doing it the first way, where I'm making the payment on the first directly to the mortgage company and the second to the seller, in this case, we would create a wraparound mortgage. So we're going to wrap that first mortgage, create a new mortgage for $400,000. And this, I'm going to make one payment to the seller, and then the seller would be making the payment to the first, and then keeping whatever is left over. Okay. In this case, I'm making that one payment to them for the original loan, and then they're making the payment on the original loan. Okay. So you can see why some sellers would prefer that. Okay. It gives them a little bit of checks and balance. Okay. And oftentimes attorneys will prefer this. Attorneys for that first person who asked will go for a wraparound, oftentimes without too much pushback. Okay. A land contract is very similar, except that legal title remains with the seller. The buyer has equitable title, but they still can't sell it to anyone else because I have a title. I would have a contract on it, and it would be recorded. But basically, a land contract just says that upon satisfaction of all the contract terms and conditions, including the payment, that the purchase price is done, that the legal title will transfer to the buyer. Okay, so it's just it's sort of the same, but in this case here, legal title remains with the seller. Okay, so that's a land contract. Assumable loans aren't around too often anymore. They were really popular back when I first got involved in the business. Now you have to go through a formal process of assuming a loan. There used to be non-qualifying assumable loans before like 1987, I think it was. But now you can go through assumable processes, but it's only certain loans, like many FHA loans, USDA loans. And then in those cases, the seller is released from liability. But you have to just read the documentation of the mortgage to see if it is something that's assumable. If it is, then you can do that. But of course, if you're going to assume a loan, you're going to have some credit issues. So if one of your reasons for doing these in the first place was not having good credit, then that's not really an option for you. Okay. And then the last one is the cross-collateral loan. Now remember, I know I went through all of these really fast, and there's a lot of information. If this is all brand new to you, I know your head's like, you know, and that's okay, because remember, we have 5 modules at an hour each that you're going to get all of this in detail, and you're going to see a case study, and you're going to see all the documentation and all those things. So don't get stressed out. So cross-collateral loan is using collateral from one asset to secure the financing for another asset. So this can be done with anything: houses, cars, boats, motorcycles, notes, jewelry. For me, I have a pretty extensive art collection, so that would be something I could use for that. If I want to buy a house and I don't have the money to do that, but I have equity in something else that is of value, then I can use that as collateral for, say, a down payment, or, you know, something. If you go to an attorney and you're trying to get a deal done, and the attorney's like, well, what do you have into this deal? And I say, well, nothing. And they're like, well, I mean, and I say, well, all my cash is tied up right now, but I do have this RV, as you know, would you like to use that as cross collateral? Then we can secure that RV to make this transaction get done. So there's things like that that you can do, and Jen's going to go into that in a full hour class on that when we get into it. So here's what we've covered in a short period of time. What is owner financing? The basics that you need to know, an overview of the various forms of owner financing, why you as an investor would use owner financing, and why a seller would accept it. We've gone into a deeper dive into each of those tools,